Thank you very much, speakers at this session. We're going to move on to the next section, which is transferable exclusivity extension vouchers. And I'm really pleased to welcome our first speaker, Pierre Dubois from the Toulouse School of Economics, and is going to talk to us about features of an efficient voucher. Pierre, you're very welcome, and please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Good morning. So my name is Pierre Dubois. I'm Professor of Economics at TSE in Toulouse. Can you go to next slide? So I'm going to talk about some recommendations that are based on research we did with Paul-Henri Moisson, who finished his PhD in economics last year in Toulouse, and Jean Tirole, which is about the economics of transferable patent extensions, which includes transferable exclusivity extension voucher. So I'm going to remind you the principle and talk about some features of the of an efficient voucher. Next slide. So basically, the principle is that you have an inventor who is given an exclusivity right for a given duration. The right is tradable, can be used directly or sold to entity willing to extend an exclusivity period. The value of the voucher for the inventor is increasing in the duration. That's something very important. So the duration is not has to be fixed carefully, because the value is going to be monotonically increasing with it. Which it means that you cannot choose a value randomly. It has to be very well tailored. To provide pool incentives, the value needs to be large enough relative to the required R&D investment. Otherwise, the mechanism, whichever pool incentive you put in place, is going to be irrelevant if the value is too small. And of course, there is no free lunch. So these additional pool incentives are costly, but they are necessary in markets under failure, like as we know in the case of antibiotic innovation. And so we take for granted that the absence of innovation will be worse. And there are many evaluations that show that it will be very costly in the long run because of the risk of pandemics. So given this, next slide, we ask the question, okay, what is the best mechanism, given that we want to delink revenue from sale quantities? So that's an agreed principle because of stewardship, because of resistance. So we have two possibilities. One is a cash reward of a given amount, okay, X billions, whatever the value that has been set by F technology assessment, etc. Or you grant a transferable exclusivity extension voucher, which has to be tailored with a given duration that is of equivalent value. So what we did in our work with Paul-Henri Moisson and Jean Tirole is to study the public finance cost of these two mechanisms. So we compare the two mechanisms to see whether we should invest more dollars or euros in one mechanism or the other. But there is an additional aspect which is very important, and we have done some other research that confirms that, which is that the voucher has the advantage of solving the free riding problem of co-financing a large reward. So the problem of the cash reward is also that it's subject to free riding, and it's going to be very hard to force any country to participate and provide its fair share in cash, while it may be easier at the European level to enforce transferable exclusivity extension. So that's an additional advantage which is not important to take into account. Next slide. So the voucher, of course, is going to be costly. There is no free lunch. It's going to be costly in market power instead of cash. So the market power is going to be borne in some countries by consumers, by insurance companies, by the social security system, taxpayers, etc. And so the question is this alternative currency? So instead of paying in cash, you pay with this voucher. Is this socially more costly than the cash payment? And what we find is that no, it's not more costly. And the reason is that the voucher is going to be purchased by a patent holder who is willing to extend the exclusivity, and is going to pay for the profit that is the market power, the additional market power will provide to him, and this amount is going to be larger than what's the cost for society, which is the difference between the rents paid to the exclusive drug patent holder and the rents paid to generics And the reason is that generic competition is always imperfect. There are always quasi-rents. So what we call quasi-rent is the fact that you need at least to give enough rents for the generics to pay for their fixed cost. So next slide. So the next slide is a very simple example to explain this mechanism. So you have a non-patent drug, which is, for example, sold at 1,000 euro per dose. It has a marginal cost of 100 euro. You need 100,000 doses per year. So if you do the computation, this is going to cost 100 million per year for the insurance system. And the firms is going to make 90 million euros profit per year. After exclusivity, imagine you have 50% market share taken by the generics and the price is dropped to 400 euros, which is typically what would happen in France. Well, you still need the same dose. After this drop in price and the share of the market between generics and the branded company, you will have 15 million euros profit for the branded company, 15 million euros for the generics. This 15 million, of course, pay for part of the fixed cost. But of course, the insurance cost has gone down to 440 million instead of 100. So basically, the cost for society of extending exclusivity is going to be the difference between 100 and 40, so 60 million. But the branded company is losing 75 million because of this with a 1 year exclusivity drop. And so basically, if you manage to extract this 75 million, the cost over reward ratio, so this is the ratio between the cost for society and how much you can extract from the branded company to pay for innovation, is going to be less than 1, which is why this system is going to be better for public finance. So what we did in our research is to, of course, this is a trivial example, to extrapolate from this trivial example with data from the largest markets in Europe, taking into account many aspects of regulation of price, taking into account the heterogeneity of the price of generics across countries, the demand shape, which is of course not inelastic, etc. Next slide. Okay, so the conclusion is that at the national level, the cost over reward ratio is always less than 1. Then the question is whether at the EU level is going to be a system that each country should prefer. And the decision is going to depend on the sharing rule applied to the cash reward. So if you, for example, you ask each country to pay proportional to his income, to his GDP, then it's going to depend on whether the cost for each country is larger or smaller in terms of market power share compared to the cash share. So imagine that the market power cost of the voucher is unequally shared across countries and in a way which is not perfectly correlated with GDP. Then it could be that some countries prefer the cash reward because it's going to be less costly for them to pay their fair share in cash rather than to pay indirectly their fair share with market power. Our evaluation shows that this happens for a few small countries, but most of the large countries should prefer, and overall at the EU level, the voucher system is better. Next slide. So, like a market entry reward or subscription, it has to be done on a set reward for innovation. So either the length of the value, and I'm going to talk about this next slide, and it has to be large enough to encourage innovation, like any pool scheme. And of course, access and stewardship need to be addressed, but this is true whatever the dealing pool incentive system. So you need to guarantee access, you need to guarantee stewardship. There is a principle, which is what once the innovation arrives, more competition on the buyer side is always better for the voucher value. So it should not be exclude large blockbusters, because large blockbusters are going to increase the value of the voucher by willing to pay more for it. So the risk of the voucher failure there is a risk if you exclude too many large potential buyers, which will be anticipated by investors. Next slide. So there is something very important for the voucher, which is the analysis of the uncertainty. So the voucher is going to be delivered in the future, and we don't know exactly when. So there is necessarily some uncertainty in terms of future costs of market power, depending on whether the voucher arrives in 5 years or 10 years or less. So we also analyze the comparison of the voucher in duration versus voucher in value. So the current proposal in Europe is to have a voucher in duration with, like, let's say, 12 months. So in which case, the buyers of the voucher are going to bid for the voucher in euros. They are going to say how much they are willing to pay for the extension of their exclusivity at the time where the invention is going to be obtained, so in the future. So the best price is going to depend on potential buyer at that time. And so, of course, there is uncertainty in the value of the voucher for the innovator. There is also uncertainty in terms of cost of market power, but this is always true. Whatever the voucher system, whether it's in duration or in value. If you implement a voucher in value, then instead the buyers are going to, so you say, okay, the voucher, we will provide a 1 billion or 2 billion euros voucher for the inventor of an antibiotic against a priority pathogen that satisfies all the criteria we want to have. The buyers are going to bid in terms of extension length, and the one bidding the shorter extension is going to win the voucher. And so, of course, this duration is a bit uncertain, but there is no uncertainty on the voucher value for the innovator. So the 1 or 2 billion is certain, which is good for investment in R&D ex ante. Next slide. And sorry, yeah, that's it. That's the end.
Thanks very much, Pierre. There will be an opportunity for questions after the next two speakers. So if you could stay with us, that would be great. And I'd like to welcome for the next talk, Tim Wilsden from Charles River Associates to do a review of some of the amendments and the compromise text from the agencies. So Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. And thank you for the invitation to come today and to see people I've been discussing this with for many years and some new people as well. So very, very nice to see you. So Tim Wilsden, I lead the policy team at an economic consultancy. We've supported the industry on thinking about the TEEV and the pros and cons of the TEEV over the last 7 or 8 years. This is a long debate that we've all been discussing with, and discussed it with Pierre many times. So if you can move to the next slide. Oh, sorry, did you not hear me? So this slide goes through many of the things that Pierre just talked through in terms of the advantages of the TEEV. So what's this doing? This is trying to provide a certain or a degree of certainty about a pull incentive that rewards innovation given the broken R&D model of antibiotics. We can't just expand the length of the exclusivity for the antibiotic because the market's broken. It wouldn't do any good. So we expand the level of exclusivity for another product, and we allow them to provide the reward for the antibiotic. This has some really nice advantages. It's a market-based approach. If we set the incentive at the right length, it provides a big enough reward. You'll hear fair share said many times through this meeting today. So we're trying to create a reward of sufficient size. And Kevin Utterson has provided a lovely set of papers setting out how big a reward we would need to do. So a 12 months exclusivity broadly provides a reward of that size. Value for money, it would bring an incentive that would have massive benefits in excess of costs. And that's what we care about in terms of economists. Is this leading to benefits beyond cost? We also want the most efficient form of incentive, that's true. And under both of these measures, it comes out pretty well. Pierre's already talked about the efficiency in terms of alternative mechanisms. If you look at the costs versus the benefits, this brings very large benefits of how much it costs. It's predictable. You can model it. There's lots of papers that have tried to model it, our own and others. That doesn't mean it doesn't have uncertainties, and there's the different structures of the TEEV move those uncertainties about. And Pierre's just described that nicely. But it will provide a certain reward for innovators that will bring some uncertainty for member states, but one that can be anticipated and is manageable. And then I think to the question we had earlier versus subscription models and RGM, this is feasible. It's something that the Commission, the European Union can do in terms of an incentive, as it's done in other areas of market failures, for orphan, for example. And it's something that we've actually got a good plan for bringing along. And there's some urgency in terms of dealing with the issue of AMR. So it has lots of attractiveness from a theoretical perspective that Pierre went through. And as you start to model it out, this is something that can be done and would deliver. And as we start to get to the practicalities of this, then obviously it becomes a bit more challenging. And we've got the European Commission proposal at the bottom. It lives up to many of those recommendations. It limited the incentive to regulatory data protection, as we all know, and that did bring down the incentive size. So from an estimate of 1.3 billion that Kevin Utterson would say the European Union should be paying, this comes down to about 413 million in the Commission's modelling. So it's not delivering fair share per se, unlike the UK scheme, but it's making a big chunk of it. It's creating a big step forward. And that was the Commission proposal. What we've seen in the discussion over the last 2 years is a set of additional ideas about how it could be developed. So Frederick, if we can bring it to the next slide. Sorry, it's a bit small. I'm almost at glasses on myself. So what we've got is a whole set of proposals so that we should modulate the length of the TEV. In fact, we've also said that the modulation has some advantages, and that would link the value of the TEV to the value of the antibiotic. We get it. There's some argument for that. We could tighten the eligibility criteria, make it more and more. So we are very sure the products that are coming through are exactly the most valuable antibiotics. We kind of get that as well. You could put requirements on the TEV. You could put a cap. You could say it has to be sold in the 5th year. We get it again. You're trying to constrain it. You're worried about this blockbusters being applied for TEVs. So we can see the argument for that. You're worried about how quickly these products come to Europe. You could put these constraints on that it has to be first in Europe or a length of time. The problem with all of these, as you can anticipate, and Pierre's already kind of hinted at, is that we're already starting with an incentive that's a third of the level of the fair share for Europe. And we're putting constraint and constraint and constraint onto it, all for legitimate reasons, each of them understandable, but each of them reduces the size of the incentive or the competition for the incentive, reducing its efficiencies. The thing Pierre kind of warned about from a theoretical perspective, these constraints, although each of them individually, you can understand the logic of it, brings down the value or brings down competition for the TEV. And that's a real concern. So if you move to the next slide, and I won't go through this, I know we haven't got time to go through this in detail, and I'm not sure my eyesight is good enough. Modulation makes sense, but not if you've got an underpowered incentive in the first place. So if you're starting with 413 million, you do not want to be doing modulation. 12 is a sensible place to start. If you had a bigger incentive, then modulation would make some sense. In terms of tightening the eligibility criteria, you would tighten it below the level that the UK has, and you would put it into legislation, so you can't change it. This would lead to a smaller number of antibiotics being eligible for it, but it would reduce the value of it over the longer term. And obviously, if you bring in a cap in this 5th year, again, you're adding uncertainty to the purchaser of the voucher, as well as reducing it. I think to Pierre's point on blockbusters, we've already done that through the RDP restriction. This is doubling down on that, adding uncertainty and further restricting the value of the TEV. So this is gold plating on gold plating to do some of these concerns, and you're going to undermine the workings of the TEV if we apply constraint on constraint. And then some of it just doesn't work with how medicines work in practice. And you've got some innovators on the panel today. The reason you apply for filing in different countries is multifaceted. There's lots of different reasons. And so you can't really put a rule like this without making it unattractive for some products. You don't want to do that. You want to incentivize the necessary antibiotics to deal with AMR. So we've got some sympathy with all of these amendments, but we think if you look at each of them in turn and you apply them onto something that's already underpowered, you're going to destroy the value of the TEV, and it's not going to do what you need to do, even though you already need to complement it with other things like an RGM or the incentives at the member states. So if you go to my last slide, hopefully my last slide. So what do we suggest? Well, we suggest having confidence in the design of the TEV. If you're going to apply the RDP constraint, use that. That's dealing with most of your concerns about value and the appropriation and efficiency. You don't need to do modulation. Let that happen through the complementary parts of the incentive framework. At a high level of eligibility, trust the EMA for how it develops its criteria. Don't put restrictions into the legislation, which are inflexible, reducing this over time. And then this cap intuitively makes, I can see why people like the idea of it. You don't need it. You've already put a cap into the value of the TEV. You've applied it to RDP. We didn't think that was a great idea, but it's been done. Do not gold plate and double down on applying this cap. And then on the EMA submission requirements, we can also see the reason for it. But if you make that too tight against the logic of why people are doing filing in different regions for different reasons, again, you're undermining the workings of the TEV. So the TEV can work, as Pierre suggested, but not if we gold plate it throughout when we've already got the protections built into the design. So I'm not sure I kept the time. Thank you very much.
That's great, thanks, Tim. And now I'd like to welcome Henry Skinner from the AMR Action Fund to make some comments and from an investor perspective, and then we'll have a chance for question and answers. Thanks.
No, thank you. So I'm going to do just that. I'm going to bring an investor perspective into the discussion around the TEVs. And first, I want to point out that most innovation in this field and in healthcare generally is created within SMEs, and that private investors are those who provide the fuel that drives innovation in SMEs in this essential part. So private investors are critical to the rebuilding of the antibiotic pipeline, but they will only deploy capital when they see a clear path to strong, timely returns. This is what drives the venture capital and private capital markets. TEVs are viewed as an attractive tool because they align with how investors make decisions, model risks, and plan exits. The predictability and timing aligns with investor time horizons. The TEV offers a definable monetization reward, helping to de-risk a market that is currently financially non-viable. Venture investors, private equity plan in a 5 to 10 year time horizon. The TEV award is at market authorization and fits well into the planning cycle. Capital is the engine for innovation. Realizing return within this window means investor funds are freed up to further investments, a virtuous cycle that ensures capital continues to flow and support the innovation ecosystem. An effective TEV generates sufficient value through competition and flexibility. Investors can leverage the TEVs as financial instruments. For example, expected predictable reward can be bundled into deals to attract co-investors. This is increasingly possible the more competitive and flexible the TEV market is. For example, the value of a TEV increases with the multi-year window for sales and application. Fewer restrictions on how a TEV is used also increases the pool of potential buyers by crowding in strategic partners, including pharmaceutical companies, to link to market access. In contrast, too many restrictions will reduce the effectiveness of the voucher, reduce the size of it, and the more difficult the use or sale of the voucher, the less attractive it would be to buyers who might not want the inconvenience and added costs. And for investors, the uncertainty in that market would be a significant drag on the implications and investing in the space. Restrictions such as applicability only in a single year, caps on revenue, all reduce viability and interest. Likewise, a too high bar in eligibility will limit investor interest, particularly if these requirements require additional studies to generate further data needed beyond regulatory and pricing reimbursement requirements. A temporary program or a limited number of vouchers will weaken investor confidence and can be counterproductive to the stated aims of the incentive, which is based on generating long-term predictability and value. And ultimately, what investors need is that predictability, the surety and security of the plan that's aligned to need and value with clear criteria consistently applied and aligned with other criteria globally, so that in aggregate, long-term investment decisions in these companies can drive to the products we all need around the globe. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. Yes, well, thanks all the speakers. I'll open up for questions now. I mean, clearly there's this tension, isn't it, in trying to ensure that a transferable exclusivity voucher probably benefits the developer, but that tension of the acceptability of the duration and size of the voucher to the health system. So, anybody got any particular comments or questions on that, either online or here in the room? Anybody else get online? Oh.
We've got one question online from David Glover.
Everybody, thank you for the invitation. I'm a health economist at NHS England in the UK and be speaking a little bit later on in the session. I've got kind of two quick questions, really, perhaps mainly aimed at Pierre and Tim. So both mentioned that the TEEV was the more efficient option in comparison to the market entry price. I was wondering whether you'd done a comparison against a subscription model and which was the most efficient. I'd be very interested in that. May not have time today, but I'd be interested if you do have the answer in that. And I was also interested if you'd done any assessment on the impact of the therapeutic area where a company had bought the voucher and had an extension to the exclusivity period. When we discussed it in the UK in the working group we had with industry back in 2015 to 2019, we were worried about potential distortions to those markets, although we didn't actually come to a conclusion, but we had discussion on it. So thank you.
So maybe I can answer on the first point. So from a theoretical point of view, subscription and market entry reward, if you have a full commitment with the subscription and that the discounted value of the subscription can be equivalent of the market entry reward, there is no difference in comparison with a voucher. So it's just a question of whether financially you manage to pay several installments versus just one market entry reward. And it's just a question of commitment of the payer to pay this, but there is no difference in terms of public finance. So basically what we find is that the voucher is better, whatever you compare to a subscription or a market entry reward. And the reason, as I explained, is because you manage to make the industry pay, of course, for this extension exclusivity, and you extract partially some of the rent of the generics by delaying the entry of generics. And that's the reason why it's better for public finance. Yeah, that's what I would say. So the advantage of subscription compared to market entry reward is only in terms of guaranteeing access. It's easier to maintain access with a subscription because the producer has a need to maintain capacity of production to comply with the subscription. While with the market entry reward, you may be afraid that they don't do it, even if you promise fines in case of inability to provide the antibiotic in the future. So that's only on this aspect that there is a difference, but there is no difference in terms of public finance with respect to the voucher. The voucher really is a big difference that instead of cash, you pay with extended market power, but this extended market power also takes some of the rents of the generic. That's why, which is necessary, and the generics need also to pay for their fixed cost. But basically, you delay the entry of generic. and that's beneficial for the public.
Maybe I can just add a couple of points. In the comparisons we've done, and we've done a lot of comparisons of the TEEV versus some of the other proposals at a European level, the revenue guarantee model, the issue is you can't ex ante guarantee the amount. It depends upon a process, often a process near marketing authorization, where you get the countries to agree to sign up to the revenue guarantee model. And that's not a subscription model. You're not guaranteeing an amount. The UK can do that. It's a healthcare system. The EU can't do that. It would be interesting to hear how it could try to do that. It can only try to encourage people to join voluntarily as you go along. And that introduces a huge amount of unpredictability. So it's not a subscription model. It doesn't have the predictability that Pierre's talking about. And so the UK could do a subscription model. That's not the same as a voluntary revenue guarantee model. That has a huge degree of unpredictability, which brings in inefficiency. So the question on therapeutic area, we haven't looked at particular therapeutic areas. It's obviously going to be the therapeutic areas with the bigger products. That's more likely to be areas such as oncology. They're the areas that are also benefiting from us addressing antimicrobial resistance. So there is a sense of the therapy areas that are going to pay for this are also the areas where there's a benefit in us making sure we've got antibiotics for those patients. A lot of the problem that's done in this therapeutic analysis that's been done is it's been done looking backwards to suggest it applies to Humira, it applies to Keytruda. No, it doesn't. It applies to the products coming through the pipeline that have RDP protections. We've got to make this real and concentrate on the real products that's been affected rather than look at the past and think it applies to some of those products. So a lot of the therapeutic area concerns are slightly misconceived, I think.
Great question from Enrico Baraldi.
Thank you for your presentation. I wonder, considering that social value and efficiency is a key point for the voucher, what happens in case a antimicrobial eventually turns out to be ineffective after a couple of years, 3 years, and the public is indirectly paid by the vouchers? How can we retract that negative effect?
So I think this is a point which is important, but applies to any delinked system. That's one of the problems of the delinkage between revenue and sales quantities. When you have a revenue linked to quantity, if a product appears ineffective, then nobody's buying it again, and so of course the revenue goes down, and so you have immediately with a delinked system, whatever the mechanism, voucher or market entry reward or subscription, you have this problem. So I think it's a question of evaluation of the quality of products. That has to be well done. But I don't know what else we can say. I mean, delinkage has some benefit, but also some risk, which is that the value of the innovation is not going to be revealed by the market, by the demand. It's going to be revealed by an evaluation by some medical committee. So it has to be well done. I don't know if there are other suggestions on this, but that's a problem on any delinked system.
I think that's right. I think a range of different approaches have been thought about to do with that, but I think that none of these systems are perfect. All of these systems have pros and cons, and you've got to look at them in the round. I think you can address that slightly with the evaluation scheme. People have talked about and looked at some degree of delayed payment over time, but that just makes the system more complicated. And I think the experience we have from incentives is where they're clear and where they're some degree straightforward. And that's what innovators need. They need something clear and predictable. And that will bring some pros and cons. And I think we all accept that. So the TEEV is not perfect. The TEEV has some cons as well as some pros. I think what Pierre's saying, and through some of the modeling we've done, and maybe I think Henry was agreeing, is the pros outweigh the cons.
Yeah,
maybe I can add.
I just want to insist on the fact that it's not only the TEEV, it's any delinked system. market entry reward is also subject to the same critique. So if we agree that the linkage is necessary, we will always have this problem that the revenue is not linked to quantity. So it's not going to be related to the market evaluation as usual with normal case.
And I would like to add also to that point that the TEV in the end from the fair share of the European context is not sufficient. So it's a part of it. So even in that case that we all don't hope for, but that a product turns out in the end not as efficient as we hoped for, and it got a TEV, you didn't pay the full amount, you paid something. So, and again, I think this is the most important point that we all need to accept. We will not design a perfect system. It's impossible, particularly in the European context, I believe. It's much easier, like in the UK, when you have one system, one healthcare that can make these decisions and go on and so forth. Here we have to unify 27.
Great, Jean-Baptiste.
Yes, I have one question for Pierre Dubois. You showed the slide where your work show that the cost of the voucher is lower than a direct market entry reward in some case, but then you also explain that in some other case, in smaller country, this ratio is reversed and actually it's cheaper to have a direct payment. But I did not really get what are actually the parameters that change this. You show on the slide the sale price, the marginal cost, the share of the generic when they reach the market. So are these parameters different in smaller country, or can you explain in which case actually the direct payment?
That's a very good question.
The lower cost.
Thank you, Jean-Baptiste. That's a very good question. So basically, you have to be careful. So at the national level, our evaluation shows that the voucher is always better because whatever the country, even small countries, the generic market is never perfect. So there is no question that the voucher is good at the national level. So if it was implemented just country by country, it will always be better. The question then is when you implement it at the European level, you have to compare the voucher cost for each country with the cash cost for each country if each country was about to pay its fair share based on the GDP. And then it's different because you may have small countries in terms of population that are relatively rich. And so they may be asked in terms of GDP to pay a share which is larger than their voucher cost. And sometimes it is the reverse. So sometimes because they have a generous system in terms of price of innovative drugs, and they have and so because of that, the market power cost is going to be larger proportionately to their fair share of the cash reward. So it's really because of the comparison between what percentage of the global cash reward you have to pay as an individual country compared to your cost of the voucher, which makes some countries, and in particular small countries, sometimes better off with the cash reward because their GDP is such that overall it would cost less for them. But if you implement a voucher country by country, it's always better. So it's just because of this inequality distribution in terms of the price cost margin of branded drugs across European countries, because pricing is very different across European countries compared to their share of global GDP. It's only because of that sometimes you have this result that it could be that a few countries prefer to pay a cash reward because it would benefit them. But our evaluation shows that it's a minority of countries. And then the question is whether in the future it will always be the case. Since you don't know and you have to take a decision ex ante, in expectation, in general, you prefer the voucher. So I hope I clarified the distinction between the national and European level voucher. It's a bit subtle, but that's very important.
Thank you, Pierre. I'm very conscious of time, but David, did you have a quick comment or question to make? But we do need to move on pretty quickly.
If I may. Enrico asked a great question about what happens if the drug turns out not to be so good later, and you gave great answers. Pierre gave a great answer that that this is common for many delinked models, but it's not just in pull mechanisms, it's also in push mechanisms. So we fund science that sometimes fails, but we need to take shots on goal. You wouldn't say to Mbappe or other great footballers, don't shoot unless you know you're going to score. You have to take shots on goal.
Very good point. Thank you very much to all our speakers in this section. We're going to move on now to talk about milestone prizes, and I'm very pleased to welcome. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I'm also going to keep it short, but everybody was talking about the cost for the member states. But what Sophie said with the subscription model in the UK, you have the stewardship included and also basically take out the incentive to push the drug on the market. I'm missing all of this in the voucher, because everybody's simply talking about cost for healthcare budgets, but not about, we don't want the drug to actually be used. And that's kind of missing.
Point is well taken. Thank you.